Okay, so now it's time for us to set up our character blueprint that will be driving our animation and giving us a character to run around with. Excuse me. Let's go to Game in our Game folder. I'll right-click and make a new folder, which I will call Blueprints. And inside this, we're going to right-click and make a new blueprint. Now, the class that we choose is kind of important here. You might be inclined to choose character, which is great and all, but not really what you want. Instead, if you go under custom classes, which if this isn't expanded, just click on the little triangle right here to expand that. And if you type character, you're going to see paper character. And if you read the tooltip, basically this spells out that this gives you a sprite instead of a mesh. And you can still find references to the mesh, but you can ignore them. So we'll click on paper character. Click select, and we will call this my character. Press enter. Now if we open this up and jump straight to the components list, you'll see we have a character movement component, we have a capsule component, an arrow component, and a sprite component instead of a mesh. Now I'm going to show you something kind of interesting here. We're going to take that source flipbook and we're going to set that to the idle flipbook, and our character immediately pops into view, but he's kind of tiny. He's smaller than the capsule. Now, you might be inclined to either shrink your capsule or scale up your character. If you shrink down the capsule, keep in mind that you might have to tweak your character movement component a little differently than mine, because a lot of the values that I'll be using assume that you have the default size capsule. You could just scale up the sprite, but what we're going to do instead is show you how to adjust the sprite size the way it's referenced in the world, which I think could be a little handier in the future. So here in my sprites folder, let's grab idles 1 through 8. We could do all of them at the same time. In fact, let's do that. So 1, 2, let's grab all of our runs. It probably would have been faster for me to select everybody and then deselect those two in the middle, but you know, whatever. So now that we have them, I'm going to right-click and go back to the property matrix. And in the properties for a sprite, you'll see pixels per unit, and that's a scaling factor. Now currently that's 2.56. So if we cut that in half to 1.28, and make sure that gets set for everybody. Actually, let's make sure we actually select everybody over here in the list first. That'll probably make that a whole lot more effective. Okay, good. So 1.28, awesome sauce. Let's close that window. And if we go back into our blueprint and go to our components, you'll see that he now fits quite a bit more nicely into the capsule. Now we are going to change a little bit of the size of the capsule. We're going to go to the capsule component, and we will set this to 96 in height and 40 around. So that fits our character pretty well. Okay, I have a couple of other settings that we're going to go ahead and get out of the way. We're going to set these on the character movement component now. I will kind of mention that these are the types of settings you may want to tweak on your own, so keep that in mind for later on down the road. So we're going to take our jump Z velocity and kick that up to 1,000. Actually, all of these numbers I'm punching in, these are straight out of the template, just so you get something close to the same result, in case you're wondering why we're doing this. We're going to take gravity scale and set this to 2, so we'll fall a little bit faster. We'll take ground friction and pull that down to 3. We also want to change air control. That's set to almost off right now. We're going to set that to 0.8, so we have a lot more control while we're in the air. Now, let's see, we're also going to expand this, and the next one I want to change is use flat base for the floor checks. We're going to go ahead and check that to true. Then we're going to also set up a constraint on a plane. So actually, probably the easiest way to find that at this point would just be to search. So let's just type in PLANE, so plane. And you'll see plane constraint normal. We're going to set Y to -1. So it'll be the direction the plane is facing. And then we will say constraint to plane, set that to true. Okay, so that should solve that problem. It should keep his movement locked onto the Y axial plane, which is perfect. Now, next thing we're going to do is make a couple of other changes. We're going to add some stuff, basically give him a camera. So let's go ahead and add first a spring arm. Because we're not just going to attach the camera directly to the character. We're instead going to put an intermediate object in there. So add a spring arm, and we'll call this the camera boom, because that's essentially exactly the way it's going to work. Now, we're going to change some things about the camera boom, however. First off, if we select it, and let's close our filter for our properties, we're going to first turn off use controller rotation. So make sure that that is off. Also, projection, actually, I'm sorry, wrong area in my notes. I have a big long list of notes to make sure I don't lose my mind here, and it looks like I lost it anyway. So what we're going to turn off here is do collision test. We do not want to do collision test. This is important in case anything passes in front of the camera, which might jostle the camera in some way. So we'll go ahead and kill that. We are also going to turn off inherit yaw. That way the character doesn't flip back and forth when the so it'll keep the camera from flipping back and forth when the character changes direction. Now, we're also going to rotate the camera, the spring arm. I'll go ahead and kind of move our view around so we can see that. We're going to set the rotation in Z, or yaw, to -90, and you'll see why. See, it just brings the spring arm straight out from the side of the character. So now we can add a camera to this. So let's add a camera component. And I'm going to name this character cam, and we will drag that onto the camera boom so that it is parented to that camera boom. So that'll be important. Now, let's see. We're going to first turn off use controller rotation for this, because we do not want this camera to use that, that same rotation that the controller does. So use controller view rotation should be off. Projection mode needs to be set to orthographic. So it's not a perspective camera. There's no depth here. We're going to set the ortho width to about 1600, but make a mental note. This is something you will probably want to change at some point. Now we're going to rotate this camera also 90 degrees. There we go. Actually, we're not going to rotate it at all. I just needed to realize that it was parented to the camera boom. And let's slide it back a ways. This is really just so that we can see it. The actual distance of the camera is irrelevant. What matters is that orthographic width. But by pulling the camera out here, it's just a little bit easier for us to visualize what's actually going on. Okay, so we've got our character, at least that's the basics of the character all set up. The only thing I want to do now is get it so that we can test the character in the scene. We won't be able to play the game with him, but we'll be able to test and make sure that he does appear. So let's close out this window, and let's create a new blueprint, and we will make this based off of the game mode class. So click on game mode, and we'll call this paper game mode. All right, now once we have that, we'll go ahead and open it up and jump straight over to the defaults panel, and we're going to take default pawn class and set this to my character. Compile and save, and we will close that. Now, the last thing we need to do is make sure that in our project settings we're using this new game mode to play the game. So let's go over to Edit and go to Project Settings, and we have Maps and Modes. So first off, let's do a couple of things here. Default game map, let's set this to my 2D map, and we'll do that for the startup map as well, because that'll make it easier when we open up the project. I'm also going to do this at the server level just as a catch-all in case I ever make this a multiplayer game. For default game mode, let's go ahead and add paper game mode, and then expand, and we'll do this for the server game mode as well. Again, just kind of covering our bases in case we ever go multiplayer with this. All right, now with that, we want to make sure that we have a player start in the level, and it appears that we do. We want to make sure that the location of that player start is at 0 in Y, and so is the surface he would be landing on, and it looks like that is indeed the case. So cross your fingers, let's hit play. And there's our character. He is standing there waiting to receive some sort of input. Now currently he has no behavior, but we can see him and he is functioning. His animation is playing, so I would call that a successful test. So that's actually going to wrap up this video, and in the next video we'll start creating the logical behavior for this character. Thanks a lot.